Hi there, welcome back to the Reel Film Chronicles. As always, I'm Nathan.
And I'm Brian.
And in today's very special episode, we're going to be talking about a favorite film of ours called Donnie Darko.
Very special indeed. I was looking forward to what, just to rewind a little bit, we were sort of talking about the next few episodes we should do, different movies we want to cover. We want to mix in some older films as we go along. And you mentioned Donnie Darko, and I almost fell out of my chair thinking, why have we not done a recording on this one yet? In fact, I'm not sure we've really even talked about Donnie Darko in a great number of years. Mm-hmm. So when did we discover Donnie Darko? Because I feel like we kind of discovered this movie together. We didn't see this in the theater, right?
No, I mean, just the whole history of Donnie Darko, it was kind of an underdog story to begin with. It was... Richard Kelly was the writer/director.
Yeah.
He was very young when he wrote this and ended up, I think he was 23 or 24 at the time he was able to direct this.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until this viewing when I started looking some information up. I was watching a little behind the scenes making of it. It's like, oh, he was in his early 20s doing this. Wow.
Yeah.
It's very relevant for him.
But it was released at, I think, was it the Sundance Film Festival initially? Got mixed reviews, got a very limited theatrical release. It actually came out just after 9/11, so it was released in late October.
Yeah.
It was actually pushed back, I believe. So it didn't get a huge theatrical run. So it really was one of those kind of cult films. And so that was in 2001. It was released theatrically. So I think we found out about it either in 2002 or 2003 then. It was shortly after its theatrical run. It didn't take that long for word to start spreading about this. But this Donnie Darko quickly came up because we were, even at that time, we were in university. We had started even back then, our kind of journey, our love affair not with each other, but with movies. That would have been awkward. But yeah, our love of cinema was evident even then. And we were specifically at that point, we're watching like a lot of the mainstream blockbuster stuff, but we wanted to get, I think, a little bit off the beaten path. And so we were exploring certain things and Donnie Darko was one of those movies that would come up in online discussions, like alongside movies like Memento, that were just kind of radically different from all the movies that we were seeing that were a little bit off the beaten path. And I think for, being university students, looking for something different than the mainstream kind of blockbuster fare that we were typically had, Donnie Darko was one of those. I think it was a reasonable kind of logical entry point into, that kind of deeper, maybe more obscure film. It's not obscure. It's weird to think of Donnie Darko as obscure or cult now that it's gained this following and its critical acclaim now. But back in the day, it was not well received by critics. It was divided audiences. Yeah. And it was one of those cool little things like Clerks or Memento, where it's like you watched Donnie Darko and you mentioned it to somebody and they knew what you were talking about, and it's like, oh, we're part of that kind of secret society of like film lovers, and it was kind of one of those code words, right?
Well, it's fair to say it's probably one of the very first cult films that we really got involved in, and honestly, this movie fits the very definition of a cult film. Very small, very low budget, muddied release that basically for most of us went straight to DVD at the time. And we would have gone out to Blockbuster, crawling through aisles, trying to find something interesting. And you're right. I'm glad you mentioned the online stuff, because the online, like in 2002, was still, a bit of a Wild West situation. And you'd really grab onto some different forums and communities and see what other people are talking about. And then, we would have went out to Blockbuster, rented this thing, and I think almost immediately afterwards we're hitting up all the different movie music stores, wherever we can buy DVDs, to go and find this thing to buy.
So we must have rented it first to watch it, because I remember exactly where I got my first copy on DVD. It was you and me and our roommate Dave.
Yep.
And we were out at a store called CD Plus, which that chain doesn't exist anymore, at least in Canada. And we found one copy on DVD of Donnie Darko, and Dave and I, we flipped a coin to see who was going to buy it. Obviously, we all wanted to buy it. I don't know why you weren't in the mix, Brian. I think you let us show down over this. But anyway,
maybe it was just entertainment value right there.
But I won the coin flip. I was simultaneously elated and kind of bummed because like $25. I think it was like, I think 20,
Yeah,
20
it's
like
not cheap.
$25, brand new movie for a starving student was a bit of a change,
Yeah.
but I got the new Arrow 4K release, the full big box set. I'm super happy with it, but I still have somewhere here my
You still have that
original
original DVD?
DVD
Nice.
copy. I haven't given it away or traded it away yet, but I still remember just like we were just desperate to go out and get a copy so we could rewatch that.
Yeah. And it's almost important to point out, like, all three of us lived together and all three of us had a great love for movies and cinema and stuff,
Yeah.
right? So we were sharing a lot of the same interests. And if one person heard about a movie, we get to subject the other ones to watching it. And there weren't as many distractions, although I have to say that carefully because we were going to school full time and there were a lot of studies that we should have been doing. But quite frankly, every single night we were watching a movie or two and really rewatching movies quite a bit too. So it became important to buy a few titles and kind of like become aware of who's going to buy what. And instead of, in Donnie Darko case, it wouldn't surprise me if all three of us had this movie on DVD in our modest collections at the same time.
Oh, at some point, yeah, when as we went through, I'm sure that when we were living together, everyone had a copy at some point. It's just like
Right.
also movies like sure, like Memento we all had, and like Alien and Aliens, all the Alien films, the Godfather films, I'm sure we all had, but like there's a bunch of kind of classic movies. I don't know if you ever had the Boondock Saints. That was another one from around
I
that
remember
time.
watching it with you, but I don't, I never owned that one.
But there was a bunch around that time, a bunch of movies. It was, I don't know, there was something very special for me. I don't know if it was partially it's got to be due to nostalgia, but that late 90s, early 2000s era of films,
Without a doubt.
and some of those movies, like in that landscape that Donnie Darko emerged out of, still holds a special place in my heart. And it's just, Donnie Darko is simultaneously, it's frustrating because it defies interpretation, but at the same time, it's kind of comforting for me to go back to and watch this film that, despite all of its eccentricities and despite all of its resistance to interpretation, and giving out easy answers, even in terms of like, defiance of like describing the plot in any coherent way. I love watching this movie. There's just something about, like, it was well made, obviously, but for me personally, I have a personal connection to this film that it maybe takes me back to that time and that place in our lives.
Definitely. I often consider those early 2000s to be this golden age of cinema for me where, I mean, hitting 20, 21, whatever, really getting to explore these movies and having easier access to a lot of movies with renting them and discovering them through you guys and other people and having the online mix in there. It just opened up the whole world. And
oh, sorry, I just thought of another movie, Equilibrium. Sorry, I'm just like, I'm thinking of all these these different
there's
movies.
so many good ones. And it's funny, like, oftentimes if I'm looking for a comfort movie, like some people say, oh, I want one that maybe makes me feel good. It's light, it's comedic, it's whatever it is. But for me, comfort movies are these 2000 to like 2004 films. Like, a comfort movie for me is Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
Early 2000s is just like, oh, this brings me back to all those days of sort of less responsibility to some degree, depends on your perspective. But
also there was like just some groundbreaking kind of experimental stuff. You look at 99 when you had like stuff like Fight Club or The Matrix. And then you look at the early 2000s where all those films we were talking about alongside Donnie Darko, like Memento, Chris Nolan's one of his, not his very first film, I think maybe his second or third, but just all these films that really kind of defied expectations or exceeded expectations in terms of genre and narrative, and kind of pushed the boundaries, especially for audiences that were kind of raised on the mainstream cinema and blockbusters. I think some of these films were really our gateway into going down, like, since then we've really expanded out our tastes and really explored film, the kind of stuff that you wouldn't necessarily see advertised alongside your Marvel's Avengers, right?
Well, that's it too. It's like this generation of movies, I feel as though has kept me anchored into fairly original, story-driven, character-driven narratives, where our industry has really gone down the road of sequels, franchises, adaptations, the whole nine yards, to become a little more generic maybe is probably a word that is not entirely appropriate, but is
Well, I think for me it's about the commoditization of film
yes.
and art,
That's yeah,
where
perfect.
people are referring to TV shows and movies and music as content, as opposed to art, and opposed to, people used to,
Yeah, yeah.
back in the 2000s, people were still telling stories as opposed to producing content, where there's a very kind of corporate, cold, calculating way to look at these artistic expressions that are really examining kind of fundamental questions about what it means to be human, and which Donnie Darko does. Maybe we want to get into the film itself. Do we want to start off with a quick kind of overview? I mean, it's a hard movie to
Yeah.
describe, but what is Letterboxd? How did they boil it down on Letterboxd?
Yeah, this is the letterbox, like, one sentence overview. After narrowly escaping a bizarre accident, a troubled teenager is plagued by visions of a large bunny rabbit that manipulates him to commit a series of crimes. Does that do the movie justice?
Not even close, but
Yeah, I mean, it is accurate. It's just like Donnie Darko does escape a bizarre accident of a jet engine falling onto his house and directly into his bedroom, and he is sort of led to commit some crimes in his neighborhood, to a school, based on his encounters with a possibly imaginary
Yeah.
giant bunny rabbit that is creepy as all heck.
it's as accurate as saying that Jaws is about a couple of guys hunting a shark. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't.
Well,
It's technically
that's-
correct,
yeah.
but doesn't quite capture, the depth and the layers of what's going on. And Donnie Darko is a film that is very complex in terms of how the film is constructed, but also very dense in terms of like the themes and ideas that it's exploring. So it's one of those movies, like one of the reasons that Donnie Darko, I think, has stuck with me and with a lot of people. It's a film that simultaneously it demands but also evades explanation, where
Yes.
you have to watch it. It's not one of those it's not one of those movies where you can quote unquote turn off your brain and watch it and just it's enjoyable at another level, but you have to actively engage with Donnie Darko, and
Yes.
you have to figure out, follow the breadcrumbs, look at the clues, and create your own interpretation. And one of the great things in the dialogue around this film is that the director slash writer, Richard Kelly, even though in his director's cut he obviously has his own interpretation of what's going on in the film, he's specifically been very good in interviews about evading that question and telling interviewers and people that the movie, as he wrote it, is up for people's interpretation. There's no one correct answer, and that the whole point of the movie was that it was written and filmed in such a way that it's open to multiple interpretations, and that those puzzle pieces can fit into multiple different configurations depending on your own personal point of view. And that's one of the amazing things about this movie, and I think it's one of the things that keeps people coming back, and one of the reasons why it's now, has this crazy awesome 4K edition on an Arrow box set,
Yeah.
right?
I think that's one of the reasons that it was very significant too. Seeing it for the first time is that it really introduces me to a world of cinema where things happen in a movie that will never get explained, are open to that interpretation.
Yeah.
And it's just like, that's okay. We don't need all the answers in a movie. We don't need to know exactly how things played out. We want to go on for the emotional roller coaster. And really, what perfect scenario to watch this, experience a movie that sort of defies traditional explanation, and watch it with a group of friends to all look at each other afterwards and just sort of be like, what did we just watch there? And it spur a whole line of conversation and dialogue over what you got out of it, right? I mean, that first time watching it, I don't even remember, it was so long ago, but I do remember talking about it in fairly great detail.
Oh, yeah.
And going online and trying to find more information out. What did other people think about this movie? What interpretations do you have here? What theories are out there? It's pretty interesting stuff. To this day, it is still a hot topic whenever it comes up in online communities. The director's cut, I didn't really realize this until I was looking it up recently, is that was more of a production company marketing thing to call it a director's cut. And Richard Kelly was 100% satisfied with the theatrical cut, but he was given an opportunity to go back in with a little bit more money and get some of the music changes he wanted, because some of the music that he wanted was a little too pricey for the original budget. So he changed the music, and I know the music choices are controversial in the director's cut, but also just kind of add in more details here and expand upon the film. And we have two different copies of the movie, one of which I think we've traditionally kind of dismissed. We fell in love with the theatrical cut. We got a hold of the director's cut and kind of did not like it. How do you feel about the director's cut now? And I know this because you said you watched it alongside this one, like you watched both the theatrical and director's cut, like in the past few days, right?
Yeah, to get ready for this, I realized I hadn't watched Donnie Darko in it must have been like a year or two. But it's one of those movies, because we watched one of those movies that was in our regular rotation, so we watched this literally dozens of times over the course of several years. So it's kind of burned it in my brain. So kind of coming back to this, but really it is one of my favorite movies, and it's one of the few times, because normally for me, I find the director's cut usually ends up being the better cut of the movies. Maybe I'm thinking too much about, I think Ridley Scott is really the king of the director's cuts. Like his director's cuts almost consistently are better movies than the theatrical releases. But this was one of the instances where the director's cut of Donnie Darko for me was all the content they put back in and all the changes they made, except for maybe one or two beats, were all unequivocally worse. They all detracted from the greatness of the original movie. And you can see going through in terms of like even the pacing, how the rhythm feels kind of thrown off by putting some of these scenes back in. Which were, I think they were all, almost exclusively, all the scenes that they put in were deleted scenes on the original DVD.
Yes.
But then they also used a couple alternate takes in a couple scenes that, from my opinion, were both worse as well. But everything about it, the theatrical, in my opinion, the theatrical cut of Donnie Darko is superior in every way, shape, or form. And for me, the definitive version of the film.
Yeah. So I ended up watching, because you messaged me late last night. Well, maybe not too late, but you messaged me last night saying you're watching the director's cut. And I realized I hadn't seen that cut in probably 15 years.
Yeah.
And during that time, I was already watching the theatrical cut. It was about 15 minutes from being over. And I had enough time for a double feature. Usually I put on a second movie completely unrelated to the first one. I said, well, you know what? I better put on that director's cut. So I ended up watching both cuts of the movie back to back.
Back to back.
Which I don't necessarily recommend. I was pretty exhausted with it afterwards, but I was pretty intrigued and surprised myself that I liked the director's cut more than I remember. I remember kind of having more of a hatred for it before, but I think I can appreciate what he was doing with the director's cut this time around. One of the criticisms that I think we had way back in the day, and I could be making this up, is that the director's cut was almost explaining too much of the movie, because not only do you have the timeline of the film sort of counting down with the 28 days, you had pages from the philosophy of time travel interspersed into the film that acted as a secondary set of title cards, which I do think kind of jars the pacing of it there, but would basically tell you straight up what is going on. It tells you explicitly that
sort of?
Donnie is like the what do they call it?
The living receiver.
The living receiver, right? And I think because we had experienced the film with a theatrical cut, and we were able to explore those DVD special features, which had some pages from that fictional book, that we were able to piece a lot of that stuff together, and then we're sort of told more explicitly what's going on. But I definitely understand that even after watching the director's cut, now it still leaves everything completely open for interpretation. Like, it is not set in stone how things transpired, right? There's so much room to look at what happened and what things mean and what they mean to you.
There is. I didn't hate the director's cut as much as I remember hating it. It was mostly the pacing. Yeah.
Maybe we're getting a little softer in our old age.
Maybe.
I was going to say, one of the jarring changes in the director's cut, which I actually made a note on, was a sound effect change where in the climax of the movie, Donnie goes back to the house with his dead girlfriend, and he leaves in the car, and then we sort of cut to two police cars racing down the street. And instead of hearing the sirens as we do in the theatrical cut, we hear like a blaring helicopter. We don't see a helicopter on screen, but we're treated to a helicopter. I'm like, so this is like an artificial way of trying to like escalate like the seriousness of the events that just happened in some way. It felt very jarring, and maybe like back to back like that. It's just like, I'm going to notice a few things like that. There were a lot of little tiny scenes and extensions of scenes. One thing I noted as well in the director's cut is that people are more mean to one another. Like there's more bullying. There's bullies in this movie, but it's like there's more scenes of bullying that I felt were completely unnecessary. They just made those characters even worse. And they're already really bad.
Well, I think Donnie Darko's one friend there gets a couple beats that make him out to be a complete and total jerk. I was like, why did they put that back in? It was just like, it just made Donnie Darko by association, made him, I was like, why is he hanging out with these jerks?
Yeah, his one buddy is essentially a racist, right?
Yeah.
And that's in the theatrical cut. And then he says something else later on in the movie. It's like, okay, we get that his buddy is bad. We don't need to be him even worse because, yeah, as you said, that by association, Donnie is now even worse off because of his association. But
yeah, I think
these are little nitpicks here, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, and then they changed like the opening song to like that In Excess song.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the name of it was. But it was
That's
really,
one of the big controversial things.
Really jarring. I think some of the additions from the director's cut that I really don't mind were some of the more interactions between Donnie Darko and his family. Yes. Because at its core, I think one of the strengths of Donnie Darko is that it is, at its heart, it's a character-driven film. Despite all the potential sci-fi / supernatural elements, it's a character-driven film. So to see those beats where there was one scene between Donnie Darko and his dad, and his dad was giving him some advice, and it's like, there was a really poignant, kind of touching moment between father and son, or when Donnie Darko was carving a pumpkin with his sister Elizabeth, because this takes place around Halloween. Just those little kind of family beats to kind of flesh out those characters. I didn't mind those.
One of the more significant ones for me was when he's saying goodbye to his mom and his younger sister as they take their trip, right? It's almost like he accepted his fate during that time, and he was that moment of clarity, saying goodbye, saying I love you type of thing. It just really strengthened that family more so.
But on the other hand, I can see why all that stuff was also cut. The only thing I would have kept in was that I think Donnie Darko gets a moment with his mom at one point where there's a story because Donnie Darko, I don't know if we touched on it, but he is a troubled young man. He obviously, his therapist said he diagnosed him as potentially paranoid schizophrenic. Yeah. He's had problems with seeing things that aren't there, like the aforementioned
Frank
the bunny, who is horrifying beyond all comprehension. Make a great tattoo though. So maybe if we get matching tattoos someday, we should get Frank the bunny. But he has a moment with his mom. He makes mention of he accidentally burned down a house and he got into some problems. So he's had a pretty troubled youth, and he's going to therapy, potentially paranoid, schizophrenic, depressed, and he's having these blackout periods where he ends up sleeping on golf courses in the middle of the road. He doesn't know how he got there. Yeah. And he asks his mom at one point, they're having this moment, I think in his bedroom, and he says, like, how's it feel to have a wacko for a son? And his mom, played to perfection by Mary McDonnell, of probably a Battlestar Galactica fame, also Dances with Wolves and Independence Day, of course. But she answers back. Really, her delivery is amazing on this, but she says, it feels wonderful. Mm-hmm. Right? So just like reinforcing that acceptance. She accepts her son and she loves him unconditionally. And there's like that beautiful moment. And I think we're in the theatrical cut, we're kind of missing that same moment with his dad. So I think the only change for me that I would really put back in would have been that conversation between Donnie Darko and his dad, to have that kind of moment with both of his parents. Yeah. I think to me that was a really kind of touching moment, and that wouldn't have broken up the pacing too much. But aside from that, everything else in the director's cut, I would not. I understand completely why his editor told Richard Kelly or to
Yeah.
cut all that stuff out.
Well, the director's cut is nearly 20 minutes longer than the theatrical, and that's a pretty sizable change when you start considering all the little scenes they add back in, extended scenes, and extra title cards and etc. But it sounds like there would be a happy medium between adding a few more minutes to the theatrical cut to reinforce some of those family themes and add to the story without slowing it down.
Well, just those bits of character, because like some of the best parts, like that family dinner with the Darkos early on, the interaction between the whole family, Elizabeth played to perfection, of course, by Maggie Gyllenhaal, who is underrated, but one of the best actors working today, I think. It's kind of frustrating because Jake Gyllenhaal, who plays Donnie Darko, and then Maggie Gyllenhaal, who plays Elizabeth Darko in the movie, they're siblings in real life.
Yeah.
It's kind of frustrating how much talent is in this one family. When you look at it, it's like, oh, I wish I could do one thing great. Yeah. And it's like this whole this family is just like, both these siblings are super talented. I think Maggie's now even like directing movies. I think her first movie came out recently. I can't remember what it was, but just both immensely talented actors, and you see them playing off each other as siblings in the movie. It's kind of that, semi-playful sibling rivalry, but then you get like those beats where parents are obviously conservative / Republicans, and Elizabeth says, "Oh, I'm voting for Dukakis," who's the Democratic nominee at the time for president, who eventually, of course, loses. With people, I know we're getting to U.S. Presidential history. It's really interesting stuff.
Well, he loses to Bush, right?
George H.W. Bush. Yep.
Because the movie takes place in 1988.
1988, yeah. But like, she says she's voting for Dukakis, and then her parents are both kind of pushing back on her. But then you see this loving family where it's like, yeah, the parents get more upset about politics than they do about their older children like swearing in front of their 9-year-old daughter, and like they're all kind of laughing about. You can cut this out, Brian, but it's like when the Donnie Darko tells Elizabeth to go suck a fuck.
Yeah.
And no, he calls her a fuck ass, and then Elizabeth says, "Well, you can go suck a fuck." And it's like, well, exactly how does one suck a fuck? It's like, well, do you want me to tell you? And he's like, he does that thing. It's like, I'm all ears.
Yeah. No, I really appreciated like the parents and adding those little extra bits of depth to them. Like they didn't have to bring the politics in, but it adds so much to those characters, to the sister, to the parents, everyone. I could appreciate the later scene too, where Donnie's in trouble with the sort of the annoying teacher there who's trying to push all these,
Mrs.
the
Farmer?
fear values on people. Yeah, Miss Farmer.
The great Beth Grant, by the way.
Yeah.
Beth,
this is the thing.
I sometimes doubt your commitment to Sparkle Motion, Grant.
This is the thing. The movie is so full of talent, like so many talented actors that just do a really bang up job here. But I appreciate the later dynamics of everyone kind of recognizing her insanity, but trying to respect her a little bit too. So when Donnie gets in trouble with her, they're not necessarily punishing him because of what he did, because they kind of recognize this person, Miss Farmer, has it coming to her. You know what I mean? Like they agree with what Donnie did, but there's a director's cut scene where the parents are at dinner and they're like, we probably should punish them for what he said. And then it just they just keep going on from there, right? It's not that big of a deal.
I think Mary McDonnell, who plays his mom, Rose, he says like he needs to face consequences. And the dad's like the dad, who's Eddie Darko, played by Holmes Osborne, who's again spot on, perfect casting, a great, strong, lovable presence as his father. His mom says something about like grounding him or making him face consequences, and his dad says like, yeah, I think we should buy him like a moped.
Yeah.
And they keep going. It's like, yeah, you want to? And it's like, and she goes, retorts back, it's like, I think we should get a divorce. And they turn to each other. It's like, oh, she's serious? Like, no, they're just like, it's that kind of.
Well, they break out in smiles.
Yeah.
It's just like, oh, that is kind of their type of humor together, right?
The kind of sarcastic kind of, but you get that sense of like, it's like any family. They're gonna fight and they're gonna have their disagreements, but like you get the sense of a very kind of loving, close knit, supportive family. Even when later on in the movie, when Elizabeth gets accepted into Harvard, and Donnie Darko is like, we should throw a party. We should celebrate you getting into Harvard, right?
Right.
So there's great little character beats, and I think for anything like for sci-fi or paranormal or any kind of narrative involving those extraordinary topics in those kind of genres, you really need to be grounded in other elements, like in character,
Yeah.
right? Like you look at something like Alien, sci-fi movie, but what really grounds that movie is the interaction between the characters, right? And I think
Exactly.
smartly, Donnie Darko is grounded in character. Smartly, it's a character-driven piece, even though it has those
That's
sci-fi
always the focus, yeah.
elements. Yeah, that's always the focus of like how these characters are responding to the craziness going on around them.
And there is a lot of craziness going on around them. Now, did you want to hit us with kind of your theory on what happened during this whole film here? Like, how do you want to approach the subject?
Well, again, one of the things I think that keeps drawing us back in and drawing everybody else, other fans back in, is the fact that there is no definitive interpretation out there.
Yeah, that's right.
And so like it's kind of one of those movies that it's just so perfectly constructed, the theatrical cut that is.
Yes.
So perfectly constructed. It is one of those perfect cinematic mirrors that you look directly into this, or maybe as Jim Cunningham's, aka Patrick Swayze, might say, you look not look at your reflection in the mirror, but look through your reflection. Look through the mirror. But I think this is one of those movies that perfectly encapsulates that idea of art as reflection, or art as a reflection of life or reflection of self, where whatever you're bringing to this movie, however you're looking at it, that's what gets reflected kind of back at you, or maybe twisted in a prism and come out the other way, come out the other side. But it deals with a lot of different topics. If you want me to touch base on some of these things,
Yeah, please get started on this.
like, do you want to go like literally what I think happens in terms of the narrative, or do you want to talk about like thematically what the movie's about? Like, where do you want to start with that?
Well, what did you pull out of the movie thematically?
Okay, that's the easier question.
Good.
Still very difficult, but still easier than making sense of the structure narratively. I think one of the things that stood out to me in rewatching Donnie Darko, and one of the things that's always stood out to me, one of the key questions or key things that Donnie Darko examines is that tension between predestination and free will, which I think if you look at kind of ongoing dialogue between Donnie Darko and his teacher, Mr. Monatoff, played by Noah Wiley. Once Donnie goes and asks Mr. Monatoff about time travel, and then Mr. Monatoff gives him this book, The Philosophy of Time Travel, which is a fake book written by Roberta Sparrow in the context of this movie universe. And they start talking about issues of predestination and fate. And at one point in the movie, Donnie starts to see these, what he refers to as spears, emanating from people's chests. They look like the water tentacles from the abyss.
Yes,
but they come out of people's chests, and essentially they'll come out of your chest and you'll follow them. And essentially what Donnie thinks he's seeing is this visual manifestation of people's destinies or people's fates.
Like where they're literally walking to next.
Yeah, so literally it's like everyone is on a set path, and he's able to see that path. But one of the interesting things he gets into in this movie with giant talking bunnies and time travel and alternate universes. So Donnie and Mr. Monatoff get into a philosophical debate, an argument that if people had predestined fate, which he also refers to, Donnie, that is, as a form of time travel, right? If you could see your own future, just seeing your future, that's a form of time travel, right?
Yeah.
Which is an interesting concept in and of itself. But if you could see your fate, then you could change your fate, which Mr. Monatoff quickly points out is a paradox, right? Because like if you're talking about predestination, if you can change your predestined path, then predestination doesn't exist, right? So I think which speaks to a larger theme of the movie. For me, Donnie Darko is all about paradoxes, right?
Yeah.
And specifically, if you look at life and you look at life's big questions, a lot of how we look at life can be broken down into these paradoxes or these tensions between contradictory ideas that have no clear resolution. And I think that predestination versus free will is one of the best examples in the movie, exploring those ideas of those paradoxes that we have to live with and that we have to grapple with, that can never be really truly solved. It's always a matter of
Yeah.
interpretation. And so that's one of the great things to me about that whole conversation back and forth.
And I like that there's a explicit example of that in another scene with his other teacher, Miss Farmer, who is sort of buying into Cunningham's motivational speaking and sort of his stuff, where all the students are given a card with a scenario on it, and they have to place that card on a scale of fear and love. And like the scale is binary, right?
Yeah.
And it's just like Donnie's essentially arguing about his scenario where someone finds a wallet and returns it without the money in it. It's like, where does that lie on the scale of fear and love? And it's just like, there's a lot more going on at stake. For some reason in my mind, maybe because that's just such a classic moral scenario, is that in my mind, the movie had him say, well, what if he needs the money to go feed his family or something? But he doesn't explicitly call that, but he implies that there's a lot more to these scenarios where it's not one or the other. There's all sorts of extra stuff going on around these decisions.
That's a great scene as well, because that ties into one of the other key themes, which was, or two of the other key themes, really. One was the idea of, there's another paradox inherent in the movie with portraying how Donnie challenges authority and challenges the status quo, and also kind of deconstructing that, suburban life and finding that darkness that's kind of buried behind that curtain of, respectability that everybody tries to put up. But that scene you're referring to. So first of all, to give some context. So in the context of the movie, Jim Cunningham is this self-help guru from the 80s, real snake oil salesman type guy, selling like just really nonsensical, the same kind of nonsensical self-help pleasantries and niceties that really he's saying nothing, but it sounds like he's saying something profound. And so Mrs. Farmer, one of the teachers, she gets really, really caught up with his philosophy. And in the actual movie, in Donnie Darko, they actually put together his like 80s style self-help videos starring Patrick Swayze, who plays the character. Really done to a T, like perfectly encapsulating like the 80s style of those like really amateur kind of filmmaking. But she really buys into this, and he boils everything down to this really simplistic viewpoint of every decision and action in human life coming down to either being a product of fear or a product of love.
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of paradox where we want to, as human beings, I think we want to simplify life down. It's like, oh, I wish everything were easier to understand. I wish we could just simplify everything down to these binaries. But acknowledging, as Donnie does, where he specifically says, it's like, oh yeah, like that whole scenario about returning the wallet but keeping the money has nothing to do with either fear or love. It's like you're forgetting about the entire spectrum of human emotions, that life, even though we want life to be simple so that we can understand it, we need life to be more complicated. We need to have an understanding of that more complicated life, because the world doesn't work on those kind of binary extremes. There's kind of some dark comedy in there where he gets called into the principal's office afterwards, after telling Mrs. Farmer to quote unquote forcibly insert the Lifeline exercise card into her anus.
Yeah.
But again, that ties into, so all these themes kind of tie together. But again, that's part of how Donnie Darko is challenging authority, right? Where he's speaking truth to power, right? He's challenging Mrs. Farmer in front of the class, telling her that this self-help stuff is nonsense. When Jim Cunningham comes to the school to give his speech, right? And then Donnie Darko gets up and challenges him. It says, how much are they paying you to be here? Keeps pushing back against him, finally telling him is like, oh, I think you're the fucking Antichrist. So like part of it is like this idea of pushing back against conformity, right? You see visually represented on the screen is like the kids are all wearing uniforms. The teachers are trying to teach this very set curriculum. When one of the teachers teaches something outside of their curriculum that challenges authority and challenges the status quo, she's punished. The book is immediately banned.
I think she's fired later on.
She's fired, yeah.
Which is so brutal. It's like, especially like in the middle of like a school term, she's just let go.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts. But there's that undercurrent of so there's a couple themes at work there, right? We talked about that kind of complexity of life that defies our urge to simplify things down to more easily understandable kind of bits, but also challenging authority, which Donnie Darko does successfully. But then there's a kind of tragedy underlying the movie, not just in terms of, I guess, spoilers, in terms of Donnie Darko dying at the end, but also in terms of the fact that all these things he does, also the flooding of the school. So he floods the school, right? He also burns down Jim Cunningham's house, revealing the kiddie porn dungeon where apparently Jim Cunningham, who was this kind of supposedly this paragon of virtue, this self-help guru, was actually, I guess, a pedophile slash, kiddie porn peddler. So he was pulling down these curtains. That was the big kind of motif, really showing like that, showing like the kind of dark side behind that suburban facade and that life. But all that stuff, no matter whether you read the film as all taking place in the deranged mind of a paranoid schizophrenic, or that you read it as actually Donnie Darko was in an alternate universe, an alternate parallel dimension where all this stuff was happening. At the end, when he goes back in time, none of that stuff happens. All his challenging of authority never happened. Jim Cunningham is still, as far as we know, peddling child pornography. His teacher is eventually going to Mrs. Pomeroy, played by Drew Barrymore, is probably going to get fired again for teaching. It was The Destructors by Graham Greene. So all the advances that he made in challenging that authority, in kind of deconstructing and pulling back the curtain of that suburban facade, all of his victories are essentially kind of meaningless. I mean, the only victory he has are essentially the half-remembered dreams of all the people involved, the people in the town who kind of sort of get memories from the alternate dimension, but only as kind of these half-remembered dreams when they wake up.
Yeah, they're more like feelings, or they don't know what they've just experienced, right?
Yeah, so there's this really kind of tragic note at the end where Donnie Darko fights back against authority, and authority wins in the end. He fights back against...
I never thought about that, but you're right. It's just like, with the teacher, especially Drew Barrymore's teacher, like, she's not actively going against authority, but she's trying to get students to think kind of outside the box and play into more mature readings in her classroom. And she's basically punished because of it. It's like the authority is the school and the Miss Farmer, and Miss Farmer basically gets the principal on board with bringing Jim Cunningham on, not only just to like guest speak, but he's in a number of scenes at the school. Like, he's almost like a spiritual advisor to the principal and the leadership at the school, which is even more disturbing when you discover that he is a peddler of child pornography. It's just really, really brutal. And it's like those people still win in the end.
Well, it's funny too, because it shows how, through Mrs. Farmer's reaction, how people want to cling to these illusions in their life, where she and other parents convince themselves that it's all a giant conspiracy, that the firefighters or somebody else planted the child pornography.
I thought that was really relevant. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really relevant today, looking at the political landscape and
that people are like so willing to look at evidence and dismiss it and think, yes, this is a conspiracy going on. This person couldn't possibly do this.
Yeah.
And it's so important because Miss Farmer runs the Sparkle Motion like dance team of their kids. And she actually believes in Cunningham so much that she's willing to put aside her responsibilities there and give it to Donnie's mother, who, it's so rude. Miss Farmer basically tells us, like, you're the last person I want to have involved on this team, but we have to go stand up for Jim Cunningham's defense here. And you're thinking, the evidence is right there. Like, it's all revealed. You're wasting your time, but they are so hardened in their beliefs and views of this man's stuff.
And I don't think it's a coincidence that she's also portrayed as very religious as well. I think in that scene where she goes to ask Rose Darko to take over as chaperone for the Sparkle Motion dance team, she's wearing like a God is Awesome shirt. Religion and those other institutions of authority play into that construction of suburban life that's supposed to be this idyllic, perfect setting where there's no problems going on. And like she's like Mrs. Farmer is desperately trying to cling to that illusion of suburban life, even when the curtain's pulled back and you see all the ugliness that it's trying to hide. Trying to use a loaded term, trying to whitewash essentially, right?
Yeah.
Whitewash all away, all the darkness in the past. And she's clinging desperately to that illusion.
And I want to also talk about the other teacher who is sort of the good teacher, played by Noah Weil, who is kind of like the science teacher that Donnie goes to and introduces them to the book that you mentioned earlier. And they get to talk about time travel, and they do break into a bunch of talk on religion. And they mention like God's path and all this stuff. And when Donnie is asking these questions about God, that teacher has to shut down the conversation. He's like, well, you know what? We can't talk about this anymore. And Donnie's like, why not? He's like, well, I could get fired for doing this. And then you have this other teacher who is so ingrained in religion and clearly like letting it influence her students and trying to bring it in, but she's doing it in kind of a roundabout way, bringing in Cunningham and all these others to bring those religious morals and beliefs into the classroom. Meanwhile, they can't have a frank conversation about religion because that goes against the school, right?
Yeah, there's certain ironies involved there, in terms of like people, and I think those conversations are still happening today about censorship and about banning books or banning literature that present viewpoints that you don't agree with or that challenge the status quo. And so all these themes are still really, really prevalent and I think relevant even today, which is 20 years after the film was made and 30 some odd years after the film was set, to still be having those same kind of conversations and still be fighting those same kind of battles. You kind of feel stuck in a time loop ourselves sometimes, right?
Yeah. If you want to have more themes to mention here.
Right. So I think just want to expand like on suburban conformity, right? Or the suburban life / conformity. I think we talked about pulling back the curtain on the quote unquote modern suburban life. Obviously with Jim Cunningham, the self-help guru, complete cheeseball. Nothing useful to say, revealed to be running a child pornography ring. Obviously, the censorship and banning of books and literature that threatens the existing hierarchy and the structure of authority. I think also it's worth noting, I think the whole dance competition of Sparkle Motion and Samantha Darko, Donnie Darko's younger sister, is on the dance team. But I think it's worth pointing out like the superficiality, vicarious accomplishments, and unrealistic expectations that are embodied by that kind of pageant / dance culture.
Yeah, that one stood out to me more in this viewing than it has in previous years, especially as we get more exposure into kind of exploiting our children in this way. And in this movie, it's a little more light, but we understand now with the greater context of our own reality of how much we put our kids through to perform in these like talent competitions and to be beautiful and all this really awful stuff that shouldn't be like pushed onto children so much.
Yeah.
And it's like there's a bit of an undertone in this movie about that and that Sparkle Motion sequence and thread.
But there's that kind of, again, that underlying darkness that's kind of being hidden by that curtain of perfect suburban life. I mean, even you look at school, the students are all wearing uniforms, an obvious visual representation of that push towards conformity, not just of action, but more importantly of thought. And that's the really dangerous thing. What I love about that scene where Donnie Darko was challenging Jim Cunningham publicly, where I think there was 3 kids that he pulled up on stage. They came up to the mic and had these problems that they want to deal with. And Jim Cunningham kept coming back to them with these useless pleasantries about, that's a product of fear. It was like, you need to, embrace love. And like Donnie Darko comes up and starts kind of speaking like harsh truths to them. Where he's like, if you want your sister to lose weight, tell her to get up off the couch and stop eating Twinkies. If you want to, like the other guy, he's like, I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And he's like, nobody knows what they want to be when they grow up. You take some time to figure it out. Yeah. It's not fear or love. And the other kid was like, you don't want to get your head pushed in the toilet anymore by bullies. Like, take a karate class and then kick the guy in the balls. Like, protect yourselves. You can't just like boil everything down to these simple kind of pleasantries. You actually have to look at the actual problem. And sometimes it's difficult actually just naming the problem and naming and just speaking that truth out loud. And you see people like gasping, and it's like, all the stuff he's saying is like are all the things that people wish they could say, right? And
I enjoy that kid was like a plant in the audience to come up with this problem, because that kid was also seen in one of the infomercials that Jim Cunningham made.
I'm not afraid anymore.
Right?
I used to think it was normal for a 10-year-old to wet the bed. I'm a survivor of fear. But I think that was something, that whole like suburban life / conformity. I don't think that was a theme that I necessarily picked up on when I was younger. But now that I'm in a decade that I choose not to mention of my life,
still coming to terms with that.
Still coming to terms with that a little bit. But looking back on that, and seeing as like, oh yeah, there's a kind of a takedown or a send up. I don't know if it would be classified as satire or parody, but really deconstruction of kind of our modern suburban life. It takes place in the States, but I think it's applicable. Whether you're in the States or Canada or in
like the suburbs are so prevalent in North America as like this town could literally exist in any of the cities that we're familiar with here. Like,
yeah, one of the other big themes I think tends to get overlooked because it's so obvious is that the film is also, it's a heartbreaking portrayal of mental illness.
Yes.
And the toll it takes on an individual and their families. I mean, you look at, if you were to strip all the sci-fi elements away from this movie and just look at Donnie Darko, and his, he's seeing things, he's losing time, he's waking up on golf courses and places he doesn't know how he got there. He's engaging in acts of violence and arson and destruction. And then you look at, he's being diagnosed by his doctor, Dr. Thurman, as potentially being, paranoid schizophrenic, and he's having what she refers to as waking daydreams. Mm-hmm. There's a scene where he calls his mother a bitch, and you can immediately see the regrets that he has, but he doesn't know how to repair that bridge right away because he's a kid, he's a teenager, right? He doesn't know how to deal with that, and the parents don't really know. You see, the parents are ill-equipped, as most of us would be as lay people, to deal with that level of, serious mental illness. And the poignant moment that I described earlier between Donnie and his mother, where she's, trying to express to him that she loves him unconditionally, no matter what kind of challenges he's facing. But obviously to see, like, she's constantly, you see the mother, Rose, is constantly drinking. The father is, he's
kind of absent, because there's that one scene where he's kind of saying, oh, this incident happened, we're not allowed to talk to people, but you tell your therapist about this. And he says, well, what's her name again? Like, he doesn't know his son's therapist name, like this doctor that he said he didn't.
But I think that avoidance is kind of natural. It's like the father doesn't know quite how to deal with it emotionally, so he's kind of avoiding it. The one interpretation of the film, which we're going to get into, like, it could be that the events of the film all happen inside the mind of a paranoid schizophrenic, that these were all delusions, that it was all happening inside Donnie Darko's head, and the catharsis at the end was just Donnie coming to grips with, essentially, like, he finds peace essentially in death that he knew he could never find in life. And so you look at that, it's often, I think, glossed over, maybe because it is such an obvious thing that Donnie is seeing visions and he's dealing with these severe mental illness. But the film really breaks down, if you look at it just from that point of view, just how much of an effect that has and how emotionally draining it is to have to manage that personally, but have to, manage that together as a family with your loved ones, and the effect that has. I think that's, for me, especially growing older and seeing, people's challenges that I know, I think that hits a little bit harder now, knowing the effect that can have.
Definitely. You want to talk about some of these interpretations?
Oh yeah, baby. You know it.
In talking about the sort of the theories, like the interpretations, there's 5 popular fan theories I just wanted to float past everyone here, basically.
5 whole theories?
Not in too much detail here, but I'm curious. We'll mention these, and then we'll get into our own interpretation of the film's events, and see where we sort of land.
Are we allowed to? What happens if we're in alignment with? Do we have to have original ones above and beyond these 5?
No.
Okay.
No. And that's the beauty of it. It's like, when I'm reading through these lists of theories, is that you can mix and match some of these. Like, some of them are quite valid, and I don't know. I love that the film allows you to just sort of place whatever you want onto it, and things can work. There's no wrong answer in how this movie is interpreted and what you take out of it, right? That's one of the nice things about this movie. One of the top ones here is Donnie was dead the whole time, right? I'm not sure how that exactly plays out, but apparently that could almost be said for just about any movie, right? Especially in this one where...
So in that interpretation, would like all the events of the film essentially like his like last minute fantasy before as he's dying kind of thing?
That's the way I took it. And I think in my mind, that is a fine theory, but it makes more sense for me to say this is part of his mental illness, that he imagined all the events just before, right? Or it is what it is. And then the second one that I saw a lot of was that it's a time loop, wherein the loop is basically starting when the jet engine crashes down onto their house. And that's why we have a countdown in 28 days.
But they're so wrong about that when that time loop starts, though. Oh.
Yeah. Well, that's the other part, is when does the time loop actually start? But it is what it is. Grandma Death, who is Roberta Sparrow,
yep,
in the film there, was a living receiver who managed to survive. And the whole thing of the living receiver, this is all from the philosophy of time travel, is that the living receiver is responsible for sort of realigning the tangent universe and bringing the artifact from the tangent universe back so that it restores the main timeline, so to speak, the main universe, right? Mm-hmm. And so presumably, in that theory, is that she had to do this before. But part of the thing of the living receiver is it's highly likely that they die doing this, and which is what happens to Donnie. He successfully brings the engine back to the tangent universe somehow and dies in the process.
Telekinesis.
But, so Roberta Sparrow, Grandma Death here, survived her incident, and that's why she kind of is a little crazy. Like, she's depicted, as a crazy old woman.
It's kind of funny because it never occurred to me until I rewatched it this time. There's like that she could possibly have been caught in a time loop at one point as well too, because she wrote the book, The Philosophy of Time Travel, and like watching it this time, it kind of clicked. So when I was reading the interpretations online, it's like, how did I never put that together before?
And that ties into another interesting interpretation that I really enjoy, is that Gretchen, who is Donnie Darko's girlfriend, Gretchen Moss, is Grandma Death. And it plays perfectly into that idea that Grandma Death is in her own time loop. And you'll notice throughout the movie, Grandma Death is standing in the middle of the road all the time, and numerous characters almost hit her every time. The way Gretchen dies at the end of the film is being run over by a car, which would effectively release her from her own time loop, right? I thought that was a really, really neat. So she whispers a few things to Donnie throughout the movie, and they have this communication, especially like through her book. And so Gretchen, Grandma Death possibly, uses Donnie to help her get out of her own time loop. And the perfect opportunity is when Gretchen is a teenager and is able to get hit by the car. I thought that one was really significant.
I think it's completely and utterly wrong, but I love it. I love it so much, even though I think it's I disagree with it 100%. I still love that interpretation. That's amazing.
I think it was a really interesting one. It's not one I'd really ever considered before. That I'm not sure I don't think there's a time loop happening here. Like, I don't think Donnie is stuck in a time loop. And there's like one scene that sort of hints at that, like literally the very first scene of the movie, where we go to Donnie waking up in the middle of the road, and he starts to kind of like laugh to himself. And some people take that as meaning he survived the previous time loop and now he has to go again. I'm not buying that whole thing, but I appreciate the idea that there are multiple time loops happening for different characters. The other one, which was kind of interesting, going back to the religion here, was Frank is God. And Donnie is kind of a Christ-like figure moving through God's path. And only because the teacher, Noah Weil, mentions that in order to make time travel possible, there's a bunch of indicators here, and he talks about portals that would sort of act as like a wormhole through time. And he explicitly says it might just take an act of God to open up a portal. And what happens in the movie theater later on when Frank shows up is that he says, Donnie, look at the screen. And a portal emerges. So I think the interpretation here is Frank is God and open up a portal, and it's just convincing Donnie to do more of his of his acts there.
See, I guess, I mean, there's obviously like religious, like Christ metaphors in the film that I think really worked, but I think it's a stretch. I love the interpretation again. Love the interpretation. Disagree with it 100% that is God and
Right.
God and Jesus. I think God and Jesus work as like a metaphor. Like I think the Christian mythology works as a metaphor for what's going on, but I don't think exactly it's what's going on. But again, I love that interpretation, even though I 100% disagree with it.
All right, so I've heard you say 100% disagree on quite a few of these. I want to hear your interpretation of the events of the film here.
Well, I don't think it's going to differ that much from a lot of the popular theories. I think what's clear is that Donnie is operating for most of the movie. He's operating in an alternate timeline / alternate dimension.
Yep.
But actually watching it this time, this is the first time I actually did conceive of potentially that it wasn't the first time that Donnie had completed this loop. That potentially he could have been going through this multiple times before at the end he finally kind of quote unquote closes the loop by accepting his death.
Yeah.
Accepting as essentially in this case, potentially it could, there's two different ways I read it. One is that the loop requires him to be dead in order for the kind of regular timeline to resume and kind of continue. And the second interpretation is the kind of more sad one where he doesn't actually need to die. It just needs to return that jet engine.
Yes,
I think what happens in the movie, that there's this kind of controversy. There's this kind of like secret cover up where it's like, oh yeah, like the government doesn't want us to talk about this. There's something about a burned off serial number. But essentially, I think what happens is that the FAA discovers like, oh, this engine belongs to a plane that didn't actually lose any engines. So there's like a duplicate engine.
Yeah.
And that's there's some kind of temporal paradox happened with that jet engine to cause this break off in this alternate reality. But that all Donnie had to do was essentially use his superpowers, which is it's implied that he uses telekinesis at the end to send the jet engine back through the time portal, back to the prime universe, or back to where we're supposed to be. The kind of sadder interpretation is that he doesn't have to sacrifice himself. He doesn't have to die.
Yeah, he doesn't have to die, yeah.
There was something earlier in the film that we touched on briefly, talking about the mental illness aspect. There was one really poignant scene that stands out to me with Donnie Darko talking to his therapist. And she asked him at one point, they're going back and forth. She asked him what Roberto Sparrow whispered in his ear this one time.
Yeah.
And he tells her what she said. He said, every living creature on earth dies alone. Mm-hmm. And so she delves into this and asked him, are you alone? And he goes into this whole back and forth. And she asked him, like, so the search for God is absurd? And he says, it is if everyone dies alone. And she asked him, are you scared? And his response is really telling. He says, I don't want to be alone, right? Because like her question's ambiguous, right? Are you scared of death? Are you scared of being alone? And for him, being alone, being lonely is more scary for him. Being alone is scarier for Donnie than death. And that speaks to the kind of isolation that I think he feels because of his mental illness and potential paranoid schizophrenia that he's dealing with, where he feels that death is a release from that hopelessness and that loneliness he feels. So part of that tragedy caught up in that, supernatural time loop could be that essentially he commits suicide, maybe not directly, but kind of indirectly allows himself to be killed because those last couple days that he had with Gretchen, where he was really happy for a while, before she got brutally killed by by Frank the Bunny before he became Frank the Bunny. I don't know how to put it. But yeah, so like essentially he's closing the time loop. So he's in an alternate dimension where he has these extra powers, obviously strength, and I think telekinesis and power over water and fire and stuff, and power maybe. I think they mentioned mind control.
Mentioned that he could like conjure, mind control. They can conjure
which
water
kind of makes
and fire,
sense because he seems to be able to have an influence over people in terms of speaking the truth and kind of getting away with it. But in my mind, it was like a quote unquote simple case of essentially like you look at Back to the Future where they create the alternate timeline. Except in this case, it's kind of two timelines occurring simultaneously. And then in order for one not to kind of destroy the other, he has to kind of merge them back into one and end that loop. Yeah. So for me, I don't know if it's been going on multiple times or just that one time, that one period of 28 days. That it's not a crazy narrative interpretation. I think many people came to the same interpretation. I think it's pretty close to Richard Kelly's own interpretation. I don't care about all the manipulated living and all the manipulated dead and all that weird stuff. Like that doesn't mean much to me.
Fair enough.
But just that whole idea of that whole time loop and alternate reality, and essentially they're obviously at the end with that storm coming, that the alternate reality, that the two possibilities can't coexist, that they have to be, all the possibilities have to be collapsed down into one, or else they're going to destroy each other, cancel each other out, almost like matter and antimatter, right? You have to have, like it's like almost like choosing a path in life, right? You can't simultaneously decide to turn both left and right. Both things can't be true at the same time. If everything's true, then nothing's true, right? If all universes exist, then no universes exist. So he has to collapse it down to the prime timeline. So that's kind of my overall interpretation of narratively what's going on. How about you? Was it all a dream, Brian?
I don't even know where to start. I think for me, I like, I take movies a little more literally, I think. And this one, I don't even want to venture into like an interpretation at times. Like I've watched this in previous years, and I'm just happy to just accept what happened here. Right? But no, I have a full thing that I like to get into, and I think I really love, like you say, you don't care for the manipulated living and the dead and all that stuff. I really like the sort of like the supernatural cosmic element of this stuff. And so for me, it's like, oh, this is like, these are like Cthulhu level ancient gods, like fooling around with this timeline.
Nice.
And I think here it was just like, okay, we have the plane engine is an artifact, and like there's always an artifact from a tangent universe. So we have our two universes running side by side, and the engine comes into our main universe, and it's up to the what's Donnie again? The living
receiver.
The living receiver. So the living receiver has this responsibility to get the artifact back to the tangent universe before essentially a black hole is created and destroys both universes. Like the tangent universe cannot exist for more than a few weeks. And that's why we have the 28-day countdown, right? And I love that it like ends on Halloween night. I just love that touch there. It's just thematically, it just works on every level for me. And so Frank,
technically Halloween morning, because the party is actually happening on the 30th.
You know, I remember thinking about when I was watching this, I mean, because they don't give the countdown, and it was just like, oh wait, this doesn't actually happen on Halloween.
They're having a Halloween themed party to celebrate Elizabeth's acceptance into Harvard, but the black hole does form on the morning of Halloween. So yeah, the apocalypse does happen on Halloween, just not at spooky nighttime.
Yeah, it's not spooky nighttime, and everyone at the party is dressed up in their Halloween costumes anyway, right? And Frank is basically the manipulated dead because he dies by Donnie's hand being shot for running over Gretchen. And Gretchen is also a manipulated dead who are trying to get Donnie to like push him forward to returning that artifact, trying to push him into those events. And Frank takes a very literal approach. It's like he appears in front of him behind the water barrier, which is like a carrier for time travel or something between these the tangent universe and our main universe. And so, yeah, basically the events of the film just kind of play out where Donnie realizes everything that's going to happen, and he kind of knows he needs to do this. And for him, I think for all the reasons you pointed out before, like he wants to die, right? And so he goes back in time to that moment where he knows he's able to return that artifact. What I really don't understand is, one, like how he travels back in time is not really explained, or why the artifact, like why the jet engine still appears in the main timeline, and we're led to believe that him dying will end that tangent universe, right? Where it makes more sense to me that it would be a time loop where his death ends the time loop. But I'm not sure how things exactly play out. Like I'm not even going to try to think, but I don't think the film explicitly wants you to figure that part out.
Yeah, so it sounds like both of our interpretations kind of borrow from Richard Kelly's own stated interpretations. I think we're taking, we're taking language. I think we're kind of sort of aligning with Richard Kelly's interpretation, but slightly there's a Venn diagram, I think, where we're overlapping a little bit. But I think what you're pointing out too is that, again, going back to the theme of paradox, and this movie perfectly embodies this with how it portrays time travel, right? Where it's challenging like the events, the series of events that are portrayed in the film and the order in which they're happening. It calls into question what seems to be one of our kind of few settled kind of fundamental questions about our perception of reality. And that is like the sequential nature of like cause and effect, and like cause always preceding effect. Whereas in this movie, you have a temporal paradox where sometimes effect seems to precede the cause. And so it's playing with those expectations. And so that's why one of those reasons why I think it's a little bit harder to wrap our heads around, because traditionally of how we think of, you know, time as a line and this cause has to happen before this effect, but we're seeing sometimes the effect happening before the cause, which I think it's a little bit crazy to think about. But I think if you're looking at in terms of, you know, temporal paradox, it makes a bit more sense, right? And so I think that that makes things play out, or it kind of quote unquote explains what's going on. But one thing I didn't account for in my interpretation was Frank the Bunny. And here's my interpretation now. So when Donnie Darko, so in this alternate reality where I think Richard Kelly specifically said through the Philosophy of Time Travel book that Donnie Darko, for whatever reason, he gets superpowers in this alternate dimension. But one of those superpowers is obviously being able to kind of look into the future a bit. And so for me, Frank the Bunny, to fit in my interpretation, Frank the Bunny has to be all in Donnie's head, where Donnie Darko is looking into the future, right? And subconsciously maybe, where he's not even conscious of this, but it's like a future memory of Frank the Bunny. Frank, who is actually, I never put two and two together for, Frank is actually Elizabeth's boyfriend in the movie.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
You see his car driving away from the house.
Yes. At the very beginning of it.
So he's there from the very beginning. But essentially it's kind of this almost subconscious memory traveling backwards through time, where Donnie has this foreknowledge that it's manifesting itself visually as this person who ends up killing his girlfriend, the one person who really loved, who's really that kind of bright spot in his kind of, in the darkness that he felt in his life.
Yeah.
And it was this manifestation of essentially his subconscious guiding him along this path that he needed to follow in the form of this person who had this significant connection to him in the future. So it's dealing with like that kind of essentially precognition in a way, manifesting itself partially through the lens of his mental illness, right? So blending that sci-fi elements into the kind of more grounded, realistic elements. But I don't think we're that far off in our interpretations. I think it's still dealing with time loops and time travel and alternate realities.
Without a doubt. I had some thoughts when I was watching the movie last night that kind of disturbed me that I'm not sure I had considered before. Maybe I'm just ripping this off from somewhere. But I was kind of struggling with the idea that time travel, even in this world, could exist in the traditional, like, Back to the Future sense, right? And because, to me, it's without a doubt, there's like a tangent universe running side by side, it made sense to me thinking that the tangent universe and the main universe are 28 days apart in how they're playing out, right?
28 days, 6 hours.
Yes.
42 minutes, 12 seconds.
And yeah, there's meaning in the number, like the number 8 appears a bunch of times in the movie. And when you add that timeline up, the numbers you just said, it equals 88. And, 88 on a side is kind of an infinity symbol. And what if the universe is composed of all of these multiple universes that are all, I'm rounding down here to 28 days apart, right? So at the end of this movie, where Donnie goes back in time, he's literally just jumping to the next timeline that is 28 days behind his, right? And I think for me, it still plays out in explaining that the tangent universe is messed up and the living receiver needs to correct that timeline, or all the timelines could kind of break down because of that. But there is another timeline where those events still play out, and we're sort of going back in time 28 days, and that becomes like the prime universe. And then there's another universe 28 days behind that one that is also kind of fine now because that other one in front of it played it safe. And when you start reading the philosophy of time travel, like on the website, and you start looking at these things, there's other instances of these artifacts that go back in time. And it kind of plays into a really fascinating thing that I see online every so often as we discover, buried within rocks, these unexplained objects, right? That we just find in our world. And that plays into this movie where those are tangent devices. Those are the artifacts that appear from other universes, and they shouldn't be there. Like this jet engine will live on in the main universe as an unknown quantity because it still lines up with a jet engine that is on a plane right now, or maybe even hasn't been made yet.
Well, no, I think that's the whole thing. Like in that interpretation, originally there was a duplicate engine, right? But in this main timeline, it was taken from the main timeline and brought over to the other timeline, and that's what created the paradox. Is that there's this engine from a plane that still has all its engines, so that engine was put back into its original universe where there was a plane crash at some point.
Yeah, there's still wishy-washy things going on for me, but I don't care enough about delving into that or trying to break the illusion. I still like that there's mystery.
Well,
at the end of the movie, that I'm like, okay, I'm fine with some things.
I think this is the great thing about Donnie Darko, and one of the things that keeps people coming back is that no matter how you put the pieces together, no matter how the puzzle pieces fit together for you individually, they're not going to fit together perfectly. There's going to be rough edges. Some of the pieces just are never going to fit. I think it fits in with that theme of free will and, versus predestination. And, are we set along predetermined paths? Do we have free will to change? I think it's, an ongoing tension that obviously philosophers have wrestled with, but I think that we all kind of wrestle with in some degree in our daily lives. And I think, like all great questions in life, it's one of those tensions that can't be ever completely resolved. That it lives, like that tension is an ongoing force, and it's an ongoing debate, and it's not about the destination because there is no definitive destination. It's about the journey. But I like how even in the movie, right, like we're all beholden to a large degree to forces beyond our control. In the meta sense, in terms of the movie being directed by somebody and the story being written by somebody. But in the movie itself, it's talking about predestination, and you see those, what Donnie describes as spears of light. Essentially, everyone has a path they follow. But at some point, like, we're all traveling down a path, whether it's one that we've chosen or one that's been chosen for us. We're going to eventually get to a point in the road where, like, inevitably it's going to carry us to that any path, whether it's chosen for us or chosen by us, there's going to be an inevitable conclusion to that path. So whether you would define that as predestination or fate or destiny, for me, it's always been a combination of some combination of free will and destiny or fate together. I wouldn't call it fate per se. I would refer more to like the random, chaos and random chance of the universe, forces beyond our control, as surely as gravity is beyond our control. All due respect to Interstellar and Christopher Nolan, and the gravity drive there. But that's the great thing about Donnie Darko too, is that you can never resolve, even our interpretations aren't perfect. All the puzzle pieces don't fit perfectly, and it's okay not to be perfect. It's okay not to conform completely. It's okay that there are rough edges or loose threads that don't always add up. That's what I love about the film, is that there's a messiness to it. Like 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4 in the world of Donnie Darko, and that's great.
And I love that it represents all of cinema for me. I don't need all the explanations in the world. I don't need movies to tell me exactly what happened. I'm not losing sleep over not knowing how that jet engine was able to travel through multiple universes, right? It's just like, I'm there for the journey. And that's what makes Donnie Darko so good. I think the characters and the events that happen are just, the characters pushing forward. It's story driven, it's character driven. There's so much talent in those actors.
When you say that with Donnie Darko, you don't need anything else, I mean, really, this is a film it works on so many levels, and it's got something for everybody, right? It's a sci-fi movie. It's a family drama. It's a horror story.
It's a romance film.
It's a romance or love story. It's a coming of age story. It's, like looking at the high school life.
Is it a horror movie? Like, were you scared by this? Because Fat Frank, the bunny,
Yes.
is terrifying to look at.
100,
and he's creepy.
100%. There were still scenes where like I got jump scares from Frank the Bunny.
Yeah.
But it's a poignant examination of the toll mental illness takes on individuals and their families. It could be read as a paranormal / ghost story. It's a philosophical meditation on some of life's biggest questions. It's this great character-driven story, but it's got something for everybody. It's amazing to say nothing of. We've been talking about theme and narrative and character this whole time and interpretations of the meaning of the film. But I mean, if you look at just how the film was shot, I mean, I was looking at, it always struck me how wide the shots were, but they go into great depth about how like they actually fought to shoot this film in anamorphic widescreen. And you really get a sense of how, like when you look at those panoramas of the landscapes, or when you look at the classroom and you see the wide shots of all the people, or the gymnasium, or even the shots of characters standing together, and you get so much. It's such a wide shot, and everything's together. Like there's that one montage at the beginning when they introduce Donnie Darko at the school with all the other characters, where it's just set to music, and it's the camera's going through the school, and you get introduced to all these characters, pretty much almost the entire main cast outside of Donnie Darko's family. No dialogue at all, but you get a sense of each of these characters and their relationship to each other.
You get insight into them, yeah.
Perfect use of the visual storytelling power of cinema. There's so many great shots throughout this movie. Every time I watch it, and I haven't watched it in a couple of years, and you know, I that's one of my regrets I have in terms of my watching habits, that some of these movies like Donnie Darko have kind of fallen out of regular rotation, just as there's so many movies to watch out there. But Donnie Darko really, for me, it does have it all, and it is one of my favorite movies of all time, hands down. Do you have anything else to add, Brian? Any more insightful insights?
No, not really.
Can I end off by reading in the movie itself, Roberta Sparrow, she's this old woman. Turns out she used to be a nun, ended up at one point leaving the church, becoming a teacher, teaching science. Now she's an eccentric old lady. She spends most of her day walking back and forth to her mailbox to check for mail. It's kind of this, very kind of sympathetic figure. And at one point, Donnie Darko actually writes her a letter and leaves it in the mailbox. And I just wanted to read the contents of that letter because I think it is pretty poignant, and it kind of sums up the themes of the movie and different interpretations. For me, this really, really hit home. It was just really beautifully written. And he says, "Dear Roberta Sparrow, I have reached the end of your book, and there are so many things that I need to ask you. Sometimes I'm afraid of what you might tell me. Sometimes I'm afraid that you'll tell me that this is not a work of fiction. I can only hope that the answers will come to me in my sleep. I hope that when the world comes to an end, I can breathe a sigh of relief, because there will be so much to look forward to."
That's a wrap on another episode of the Reel Film Chronicles podcast. Thank you for listening and hanging out with us today. We really appreciate your support and look forward to you joining us for the next episode. We can be found around the internet and social media, with our home base being reelfilmchronicles.com, which will have all the links you need to follow and keep in touch with us. Until next time, take care of yourself and others, and keep your film journey going.